You are John Ashcroft, incumbent Republican senator from Missouri, and you just lost your reelection bid for the U.S. Senate. Luckily for you, it's the year 2000, and everybody's saying Florida, 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 dealing with the debacle in Palm Beach County and not paying attention to your election. But if it wasn't for Florida, everyone would be looking at your election because you, John Ashcroft, just lost to a dead man. And no, we're not talking about somebody who died yesterday and nobody knew that they were voting for a dead man. No, we're talking about somebody who died 2.5 weeks before the election and everybody knew they were voting for him. Welcome to the 2000 Missouri Senate race between Mel Carnahan, the deceased Democratic governor of Missouri, and John Ashcroft, the very much alive Republican incumbent senator from Missouri. My name is Dave. Welcome to Election History, a channel focused on the history of campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and so on. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe and like the video. If you would like to suggest a topic to talk about in the future, please put it in the comments below, as I'm always looking for new topics to talk about in the future. On election night 2000, John Ashcroft, the freshman senator from the state of Missouri, lost to Mel Carnahan, the Missouri governor who had died in a plane crash 2.5 weeks earlier. According to the state of Missouri, it was too late to remove Carnahan's name from the ballot, and instead Carnahan's wife, Jean Carnahan, became the candidate for the Democrats. It was, and still is, the only time that a dead candidate on the ballot for U.S. Senate has actually been elected. But how did we get here? Well, first let's go ahead and look at the two candidates that ran, and let's start with the candidate that was the incumbent, John Ashcroft. In 1972, John Ashcroft was a 30-year-old assistant law professor at Southwest Missouri State University when he decided to take a break from his legal teaching and run for Congress. At the time, the Republican Party was broken up into three strands: a moderate approach of Richard Nixon, the liberal approach of Nelson Rockefeller, and a much more conservative approach of Ronald Reagan, who advocated for both social and economic conservatism. Ashcroft very much fell in the Reagan camp, though he was a supporter of Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign. In the primary, he ran against Gene Taylor, who Ashcroft pointed out was a Rockefeller Republican in 1968, but Ashcroft would lose his bid for Congress in the primary against Taylor. After his defeat, newly elected Governor Kit Bond appointed Ashcroft as state auditor, a position that Bond held previously before he became governor, and during this time as auditor, Ashcroft was actually praised by many, including the press, even though he didn't have a great deal of background in auditing. He eventually lost the auditor election in 1974 with his Democratic opponent, George Laird, claiming that Ashcroft didn't have any auditing experience and that his appointment was just a political move by Kit Bond, which was probably right. After the election, many Republicans and conservatives encouraged Ashcroft to run for the U.S. Senate in 1976 against John Danforth, a moderate Republican and current Attorney General of Missouri. However, Danforth and Ashcroft were friends, and Danforth hired him as an assistant Attorney General, where he would work alongside future Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. This meant that Ashcroft would run for Attorney General at the same time that Danforth would run for the U.S. Senate in 1976. Ashcroft would win a close race for Attorney General with 51.2% of the vote and would win re-election in 1980 with 64.4% of the vote. With this statewide profile, Ashcroft ran for governor in 1984, beating Lieutenant Governor Ken Rothman with 57% of the vote, and he would run for re-election, winning 64% of the votes. With the Missouri governorship being term limited, Ashcroft ran for the U.S. Senate in 1994, which was the Contract with America election, which saw Republicans dominate the congressional and Senate elections. And of course, here we are, he ran for re-election in 2000. As for Mel Carnahan, he started politics at a young age as well. His father, A.S.J. Carnahan, was a member of Congress for Missouri from 1945 to 1961, with a one-term break due to being defeated for re-election in 1946. In 1960, Mel Carnahan became a local judge in Rolla, Missouri, and 2 years later, he would run and win for the Missouri State House of Representatives. He was elevated to floor majority leader in the House in 1965, and it was in these early years that he started to show his progressive and liberal side, something that was not uncommon in rural politics back in the 1960s. After redistricting of the state in 1966, Carnahan decided to run for state senate against Gene Sally. Sally campaigned on saying that Carnahan came from a well-to-do family and was out of touch with the working class people of his district. Carnahan won the primary but lost the general election against the incumbent Republican senator, which was considered a bit of a surprise. After being out of politics for a few years, Carnahan decided to jump back into politics and run for state treasurer. Carnahan easily defeated Representative Ed Sweeney in the primary, as well as Republican Gene Winship in the general election. Now he was part of the Missouri cabinet, along with Attorney General John Ashcroft. In 1984, Carnahan ran for governor, but was defeated by Ken Rothman in the Democratic primary, who we mentioned previously. While Carnahan did have some money, he decided to take a grassroots approach to his campaign, walking the length of the state to talk to voters. Carnahan knew that he couldn't compete against Rothman's war chest, and right before his defeat, Carnahan said that if he didn't win the election, he would probably pack up and go back to Rolla, but of course we know that didn't happen. After being out of politics for 4 years, Carnahan decided to run for lieutenant governor of Missouri in 1988, in which he won. This would make him the lieutenant governor under Governor John Ashcroft, which began the rivalry between these two, with these two rarely seeing eye to eye. After Ashcroft was term limited as governor in 1992, Carnahan ran for governor, winning by 17%. He ran for re-election in 1996, again winning by 17%. During his time as governor, Carnahan remained pretty progressive, as he did when he was in the state legislature. He had no problems with proposing to raise taxes to fund new schools. He was also an early pioneer of mandating that health insurance companies ignore pre-existing conditions, which is now part of Obamacare. Still, he supported other progressive ideas like expanding Medicaid, but what he might be most well known for today is vetoing the abortion ban bill in Missouri that was enacted once the Dobbs decision was handed down. The legislature overturned his veto in 1997, but 26 years later, the voters of Missouri overturned the legislature. One day after the 1998 election, Mel Carnahan announced that he would be running against John Ashcroft for the U.S. Senate. However, John Ashcroft was considering running for the presidency. Since he had built a reputation as being a staunch conservative, many Republicans in conservative circles asked him to consider running for the presidency. But on January 4th, 1999, Ashcroft decided to run for re-election to the U.S. Senate instead. Immediately, the mudslinging started, with Carnahan calling Ashcroft someone who is very far to the right, and Ashcroft saying that Carnahan was a tax-raising liberal. These are the smallest of mudslingings that we would see in this campaign. One of the first hurdles that Carnahan had to overcome was the commuting of the death sentence of convicted murderer Darrell Mease. Now, Mease was sentenced to death, but after a personal plea from Pope John Paul II, who had visited St. Louis in January of 1999, Carnahan commuted Mease's sentence. Still, the decision by Carnahan did hurt him politically, with Catholics and other Democrats saying that while they wouldn't challenge him on his decision, they didn't necessarily agree with his decision. On February 18th, Ashcroft broke his silence and said that he would have executed Mease, stating that the verdict of the jury should have had more power than a plea from the Pope. Now that the campaign was purely on its way, the first head-to-head poll showed John Ashcroft was in the lead. According to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch poll, John Ashcroft had 44.5% support, with Carnahan at 36.9%. Another way that Ashcroft was trying to be tough on crime was by supporting Missouri's Proposition B, which would allow concealed carry gun laws in the state. This proposition would be voted down by the voters in April of 1999. However, Ashcroft actually opposed concealed carry laws in the past, when in 1992 he said that he had grave concerns about any types of laws, saying, "Overall, I don't know that I would be one to want to promote a whole lot of people carrying concealed weapons in this society. Obviously, if it's something to authorize everyone to carry concealed weapons, I'd be concerned about that." Many argued that the NRA already contributing $27,000 to his campaign could have led to his decision to support this proposition, making him appear more as a candidate who is bought and paid for. Toward the end of 1999, abortion started to become a hot issue in the Senate race. When Ashcroft was governor, he signed abortion restrictions, including a ban on the procedure in public facilities. Also, as a U.S. Senator, Ashcroft voted for late-term abortion bans. On the other hand, Carnahan vetoed a late-term abortion ban just to have the veto overturned by the legislature, in which Democrats were actually in charge. Both sides would label the other as abortion extremists, but the abortion issue did cause a bit of tension in the Democratic ranks in Missouri. Also, at the same time as the abortion ban debates in the Missouri legislature, it was reported that John Ashcroft accepted money from Linda Tripp's legal defense fund. Now, if you don't know who Linda Tripp is, she illegally taped phone calls between her and Monica Lewinsky, which were used to impeach Bill Clinton. Ashcroft was the first senator to call for Clinton's resignation once the allegations became public. Still, the Tripp Defense Fund paid Ashcroft's political action committee, called the Spirit of America, $25,000, in which Ashcroft's donors list was given to the defense fund to raise money. By December, the Federal Elections Commission filing would show that the PAC would make $97,000 in contributions by selling their contributors list to other organizations, which became a minor controversy in this campaign. But a few weeks later, Carnahan would have his own controversy. Photos from 1960 surfaced showing Mel Carnahan wearing blackface at a fundraiser as a member of a barbershop quartet. Anyway, Carnahan said, quote, "I certainly regret my participation in this kind of theater, and I sincerely and readily apologize for my insensitivity of 39 years ago." End of quote. Though this did not really hurt him with any of his black supporters, and most were generally accepting of his apology. But the attacks didn't stop there. In November 1999, still 1 year before the election, both campaigns attacked the military service of the other. The attacks on Carnahan was that his official biography said that he joined the Air Force in 1954 after graduating college, quote, "during the Korean War," unquote. While never saying that he actually fought in Korea, the Republicans were making it look like he was trying to say that, since the armistice for that war was signed on July 27th, 1953. Still, this was very verifiable, and one can see that Carnahan did not actually participate in the Korean War. On the other hand, attacks on Ashcroft were on his student, work, and fatherhood deferments that he received while working as a law professor during the Vietnam War. Ashcroft would receive draft deferments in 1963, 1964, 1965, 1966, 1967, and 1969. By the time the fatherhood deferment was abolished, Ashcroft was 27 years old and too old to be drafted. Now, in a show of good spirit, both campaigns signed a, quote, "framework of civility," which tried to tone down the campaign. In this framework, the campaigns agreed to refrain from using depictions, half-truths, falsification, or innuendo in describing their opponents, as well as regarding degrading, disparaging, or demeaning descriptions or visual images of their opponents. But did this stop the attacks? Nope. In February, Carnahan attacked Ashcroft for accepting an honorary degree from Bob Jones University, an institution most notable for prohibiting interracial dating and considering the Catholic Church a, quote, "satanic cult," unquote. Ashcroft's campaign staff said that they didn't know about the history of the university before accepting the honorary degree, but Carnahan said that Ashcroft should return the degree as well as release the text of his speech that he gave at the university. Ashcroft responded by saying that he would return the honorary degree if Carnahan returned all the money that he received from abortion rights groups. So yeah, that whole framework of stability thing, that didn't last for long. And by the way, there's no indication that Ashcroft actually gave the degree back to Bob Jones University. By mid-February of 2000, polls had tightened up in the U.S. Senate race. In a St. Louis Post-Dispatch Zogby International poll, showed Carnahan now slightly ahead, 47 to 45%, the same poll the year before showing Ashcroft far ahead of Carnahan. Another poll a few weeks later by the Kansas City Star showed that Ashcroft had a 47 to 44% lead over Mel Carnahan. Both of these polls were within the margin of error. While the attacks did keep coming, by the summer, at least the attacks were more focused on policy instead of personal attacks that had persisted throughout 1999 and into the early part of the 2000s. Yes, the campaign was nasty, but at least it was based on issue-focused information and not on personal mudslinging. And the issues that were being put to the forefront were always guns, crime, death penalty, and abortion. In July, the Kansas City Star conducted a poll that showed that the race was still a statistical dead heat, with John Ashcroft at 47% to Mel Carnahan's 43%, with a 4% margin of error. From this point on, the campaign was just mudslinging on a daily basis. Yes, they did talk about issues, but a lot of the rhetoric was about campaign contributions, with attacks against Ashcroft for taking money from the NRA and Big Ag, while Carnahan was being attacked from taking money from Hollywood elites and Playboy's Hugh Hefner. As we entered into the final full month of the campaign, issues began to shift as the national candidates Al Gore and George Bush started talking about healthcare, Social Security, and education. So were the U.S. Senate candidates in Missouri. Unlike crime, which was fighting on John Ashcroft's turf, these new issues were fighting on Mel Carnahan's turf. The Democrats were starting to see momentum in Missouri, and as a matter of fact, an American research poll found that Al Gore was now actually leading George Bush in Missouri 43% to 40%, with a large number of undecided voters. But there was good news for the Carnahan campaign, as an internal poll conducted between October 10th and 12th by the Hickman Brown Research Group showed that Carnahan had a 45 to 42% lead. This was within the margin of error, but still Carnahan was on top, something that the campaign hadn't seen for quite a while. In October, both candidates agreed to debate twice. In both of the debates, candidates surely showed their differences and fought against one another. However, the tone of the debates were less combative compared to the preceding 12 months of the campaign. This more mild tone might have been to win over more moderate voters, and striking a calmer tone might have helped. And this would make sense, as a large number of undecided voters, around 15% at the time, were mostly identified as being moderate voters. After the last debate on the 15th, Carnahan returned to Jefferson City to take a rest and continue his campaigning the next day. On October 16th, Carnahan started off his day at the governor's mansion and set out early to hit the campaign trail, as there were less than 3 weeks to go in the election. Most of the day he spent in the St. Louis area, but then was preparing to fly down to New Madrid to meet with some African American leaders in the Boot Heel of Missouri. The flight that he was to take, departing from Cahokia, Illinois, took off at around 7 p.m. that evening. Carnahan's son Randy was the pilot. Also on board was Chris Sifford, Carnahan's chief of staff and top campaign advisor.
This is News Channel 5 at 5.
A plane believed to be carrying Governor Mel Carnahan, his son Roger, and senior campaign advisor Chris Sifford went down in Jefferson County.
We heard a large explosion which shook our patio doors.
The whole house just shook.
There were no survivors.
It was a slow process, but the agonizing news finally began to sink in.
Our thoughts are very much with the families at a time.
The highest-ranking leader in the state of Missouri is dead. Federal investigators search for answers in Jefferson County, and Mr. Carnahan's replacement, Lieutenant Governor Roger Wilson, looks to the people of Missouri for support.
And I would like to ask for permission to lean on about 5 million Missourians' shoulders.
I will remember him, and all of Missouri will remember him for that exemplary public service and for his dedication to his family as a husband, as a father, and as a grandfather.
It's hard to be real exuberant and real feisty when there's a serious tragedy that's taken place in the state in which we're having the debate in front of, 100 some odd folks from Missouri.
Mel was a fantastic individual, a great public servant with a compelling vision for the future of this state and our country. It is a tremendous loss, and our hearts grieve with the people of this state, with his family especially, and again with the Sifford family.
After the funeral, the press talked about all of the accomplishments that Carnahan had achieved during his time as governor. The main focuses were on education spending, tax cuts, and fiscal responsibility. Rarely did the issue of crime, the death penalty, or other issues that hampered the Carnahan campaign were mentioned. It was overwhelmingly positive, as one would expect after death of the incumbent governor. John Ashcroft also decided to suspend his campaign until after the funeral. Still, nobody had a clear idea how this election would go, since there were less than 3 weeks until Election Day. But let's first start off with the Democrats. Many prominent Democrats hoped that the governor's wife, Jean, would run for the seat, but she was reluctant to do so. Still, because many Missourians assumed that she would take Mel's place, she needed to make a public statement as to whether she would continue Mel's fight or pass it on to somebody else. Mark Farinella, Mel's campaign manager, suggested that Jean meet with Saul Shore, Mel's media consultant. The three of them met up and wrote up two statements, one if Jean decided to run for the seat, and another one if Jean decided not to run for the seat. According to Jean Carnahan's book, Don't Let the Fire Go Out, on the day of the recording, Shore decided to record the yes video first, the one that would indicate that she would run for Mel's seat. After the recording of the yes video, everyone took a bit of a short break. Then Shore asked Jean, "Are you ready to do the other version?" She replied by saying, "No, let's go with the first one." And that's the moment she accepted being the replacement for her husband, something that the new governor, Roger R. Wilson, had already said that he would agree to if Mel Carnahan was elected. Jean Carnahan did not actively campaign. She did a few television interviews. One of those interviews was with Cokie Roberts of ABC, who also lost her father, Louisiana Congressman Hale Boggs, in an airplane crash in Alaska in 1972. Most of the campaign was based on post-funeral press that Mel had received, showing how well he ran the state and creating a grassroots final push organized by Mark Farinella, who Jean said, quote, "In the end, he," Mark that is, "would be the driving force that pulled together labor, women, staff, and volunteers, forging a team and giving everyone a sense of a mission." Farinella said after the election, quote, "We all began to understand that this election was not just about Mel Carnahan, it was about the things he stood for, and we still had the responsibility to carry those ideas forward." On the Republican side, the attitude was a little bit different. After Carnahan's death, most large media outlets thought that Ashcroft was easily going to return to Washington, quote, "barring a stunning change of events," as said by John Flory of the Columbia Daily Tribune. The Cook Political Report's Jennifer Duffy moved the race from a toss-up to lean Republican. At first, Ashcroft seemed to be on the right foot, not really talking about Carnahan and keeping the campaign positive. Still, on October 28th, a Kansas City Star poll release showed that Mel Carnahan and John Ashcroft were tied at 46%. But when Jean Carnahan's name was asked, she actually took a 2-point lead, 47 to 45%. Another poll done by the St. Louis Post-Dispatch also showed Carnahan winning 49.1% to 44.3%, with the number of undecided voters starting to dwindle. Carnahan seemed to be winning over these undecided voters. But the Republicans were ready to commit some unforced errors that might have led to their eventual defeat. The first one was the criticism of Jean Carnahan as the replacement to Mel Carnahan. On October 24th, U.S. Senator Kit Bond said that picking Jean was a move by the Democrats for, quote, "Jefferson City politicians to ask Missouri voters for a blank check on a Senate seat," unquote, and stated that Jean Carnahan should only be given the seat if she won it as a write-in candidate. This immediately politicized the matter, something that, to his credit, John Ashcroft refused to personally take part in. The Republicans were also saying that the appointment of Jean Carnahan, if Mel's candidacy prevailed, would be a violation of the Hatch Act. However, Missouri Attorney General Jay Nixon said that the Hatch Act, quote, "does not prohibit the governor from announcing who he intends to appoint to the U.S. Senate, nor does it prohibit the people from voting for a candidate of their choice." Furthermore, on October 30th, Ashcroft said that the pause that they took during the death and funeral of Mel Carnahan hurt his campaign, saying, quote, "frankly, a number of the political pundits said that hurt our campaign, and it may have." Even though he said that pausing his campaign was the right thing to do, the remarks came across as blaming any eventual loss on the death of Mel Carnahan, forcing him to pause his campaign. While this might not have been his intention, he did receive some backlash from these comments. Finally, and maybe the biggest unforced error, the Republicans continued to challenge the legitimacy of not Jean Carnahan's campaign, but Mel's as well. The Republicans started floating the idea that since Mel Carnahan was dead, that he was no longer a citizen of Missouri. This meant that he could technically not run for the U.S. Senate. But as the other ill-timed criticisms of Carnahan, this one looked the worst. It seems as if the Republicans just thought that Ashcroft should win simply because he was the only living candidate, thus making this a win by proclamation. This came across more as the Republicans trying to steal the election instead of Ashcroft trying to win it in his own right. Then we come to Election Day. Ashcroft took an early lead, doing well in rural Republican counties, but when St. Louis City started to count, notorious for being really slow in their counting, still today even, Carnahan overtook Ashcroft. The day after the election, John Ashcroft conceded to Gene Carnahan, saying, quote, "I believe the will of the people has been expressed with compassion, and I believe the people's voice should be respected and heard," end of quote. He further stated that any attempts by the Republicans to challenge Carnahan's victory should be called off, saying, quote, "I reject any legal challenge to this election," end of quote.
Lincoln never saw his nation made whole again. Susan B. Anthony never cast a vote. Martin Luther King Jr. never finished his mountaintop journey. My husband's journey was stopped short, too. And for reasons we don't understand, the mantle has now fallen upon us. We remain heirs of a legacy, bearers of a dream. On this night, I pledge to you, rather, let us pledge to each other, we will never let the fire go out. God bless you always. Thank you.